need someone to talk to and you don't know what to do, call us 214-4400 when you're feeling all alone and they turn their back on you. Call us 214-4400. Call us 214-4400. Call us 214-4400. Call us.
Welcome to the Kind Counseling Podcast. I'm your host, Dania Roberts. Once again, we're here to give insights and to share information, as well as bring light to various topics that affect our communities at large. Kind Counseling is a mental health practice that gives hope to the hopeless through mental health empowerment and spiritual insight. And today we have a great show for you guys. We're discussing women and trauma with our special guest. Now, I'm flying solo today. Everybody abandoned me. It's summertime. They're hanging out. I can't find none of them co-hosts. But anyway, it is what it is. All right. So this is a topic that affects a lot of my clients, and I thought it would be great to bring in someone who could really address, the topic of trauma and women. So today we have Ayanna Ali, our special guest, and let me just tell you guys a little bit about her. Ayanna is a licensed clinical social worker and coach with 22 years of professional experience. Having worked with a diverse client population and in a variety of settings, she now specializes in the treatment of career women living with debilitating anxiety. All right. Ayanna also works intensively with women suffering from the trauma experienced as a result of infertility and pregnancy loss. She's committed to providing a safe space for women not only to grow in, but to heal and thrive in as well. Let's welcome Ayanna Ali. All right. How you doing, ma'am?
I'm good. How are you?
Good, good, good. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be
Yes,
here.
yes. Now today in society, like the word trauma is thrown around a lot,
Mhm.
and everybody is, oh, it's your trauma, it's your trauma. Maybe you could just help us by just explaining to our listeners what exactly is trauma.
Yeah. So, broadly, trauma is the negative effects or the effects of the impact that something um, that is not positive and something that is in some way either physically or emotionally, psychologically, or all of those things harmful. And so you can experience trauma if something has happened to you, if you were in an accident, if you experience an assault. You can also experience trauma vicariously if
Okay.
you've heard about it, or if are very familiar with someone who has been themselves traumatized. You can also then become traumatized as a result of spending time with them and being witness to their trauma responses. And so it's something that's very serious, and it's something that can affect you personally or can affect someone that you love and then wound up, finding its way into your own life and causing harm and damage.
I muted myself. Sorry about that.
It's
So,
okay.
if you could maybe give us some examples of trauma cases that you work with some of your clients, just so that people can know.
Yeah, sure. So I think that, one of the things that comes to mind when we think about trauma are things like war and violence.
Mhm.
Obviously there are wars going on around the world. One of the wars that we see a lot of imagery from right now is the war in Ukraine, and we're constantly being bombarded with pictures of buildings that have been shelled out, or
Mhm.
hearing gunfire and seeing the aftermath of military violence. So someone living in the Ukraine or someone spending time in the Ukraine, obviously could be a victim of trauma, or could suffer from trauma because there's a constant like sensory bombardment, whether it's sounds, whether it's smells, whether it's feelings, um, that are a reminder of the difficulty. So I have worked with, people who have come from war-torn countries and who are traumatized as a result. I think something that, unfortunately is very common, especially for Black women, is, sexual trauma. Uh, you know, um, you can read a lot of different statistics, and it, depends on where you're looking. But what we do know is that a large number of Black women experience sexual trauma at some point throughout their lives, many on a repeated basis. And that is because either they've been subject to, non-consensual sexual acts being performed against them, or having to participate in those acts, or they've been coerced, and the feeling has been uncomfortable, and it has led to feelings of powerlessness and, psychological distress. So that's unfortunately a trauma that many people are either familiar with themselves, or know of someone who has experienced that trauma. So certainly, as someone who works with women,
Mhm.
I work with people all the time who unfortunately have experienced sexual trauma and continue to suffer the effects of it, years later often.
Okay, so what would trauma look like in terms of if someone were to say like, yeah, I think that's trauma, like what would that look like in someone's everyday life, like what would that look
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I think trauma shows up in a lot of different ways for different people.
like?
Um, I think one of the ways that people are familiar with trauma and its manifestations is, an example of someone who has like PTSD, post-traumatic stress
Right.
disorder. So that could be something like a very strong startle response. So like a loud noise, something like the backfiring of a car, or, firecrackers on a holiday. Those people might have a very, very strong kind of startle response and be unable to distinguish between, let's say, a gunshot and a car backfiring. And any loud noise would kind of unnerve them. Trauma can also look like hypervigilance. So, if someone, let's say, was robbed, or someone was somehow physically assaulted, and now every time they walk down the street, they're looking behind themselves, or they're afraid to get into an elevator with people, or they're afraid when people come close to them. And it makes them not only worried, but actually like almost maybe a little bit paranoid. They don't want people coming near them. They're not comfortable in the presence of other people, even if these people are, don't mean them any harm. It's like they're always being on guard. And so, we can experience and express our trauma physically, but we can also do it emotionally. So I think quite often when we talk about Black women, we talk about like the idea of like the strong Black woman, right? And the idea that many Black women feel that it's not acceptable or permissible for them to be soft, or, to be vulnerable, and that they always have to demonstrate like this toughness, or this, lack of emotion. So that's an example sometimes of trauma too. You know, Someone witnessing something that's very sad that would make many people cry, someone's inability to cry upon witnessing something like that could be an example of trauma, where the natural and normal emotional experience that that person would undergo in certain circumstances, they just can't access those emotions, or they can't get in touch with it because they need to protect themselves.
You're listening to the Kind Counseling Podcast. Feel free to hit the like button and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Now back to the show. Okay, all right. So what are some of the common areas of trauma that Black women face on a regular basis that may be only common to their experience?
Yeah, well, I just talked about the fact that, many Black women have suffered sexual trauma, and they're also at a higher risk of suffering repeated sexual trauma, much more so than their other race counterparts. So that's a common one. Um, I think what's unique to Black women is that not only are they, as women, often subjected to, racism and the trauma that comes with, being a Black woman in the society, but then they're also subjected to sexism because they're women. So it's
Okay.
like a double down effect of, being a woman and being subjected to patriarchy and sexism, and being thought of as, perhaps not as educated or not as capable, because of their body, because of how they show up physically or how they were born physically. And then they also are experiencing the effects and the everyday kind of results of being a Black woman in a society that, isn't kind often to Black people. And so, you're dealing on a regular basis with two big isms that you have to battle. And, that certainly can be stressful. And that certainly can be something that can make you feel like you're in a constant uphill battle.
Okay. All right. So tell me a little bit, how did you become so interested in trauma? Like, was there like a specific thing that happened, or I mean, like, tell me a little bit about
So, I have my own trauma. Unfortunately, I've experienced infertility and pregnancy loss, and I've also experienced what I kind of like refer to as like racialized like medical mismanagement surrounding like pregnancy, and certainly have experienced some not so positive like medical experiences. I believe because I was a Black woman showing up at a hospital or in a medical facility. But those really are things that I experienced like the second half of my life. I would say growing up, and
it?
I would not have described myself as someone who was traumatized. I came from a really good family and just, felt like I had a pretty good life. I think I became very aware of how many people are traumatized and how much kind of a unicorn I was in terms of not having been able to
Okay.
say, that I experienced trauma early on when I started doing, mental health work. And I was always interested in mental health. At one time, I wanted to get a PhD in psychology. I majored in psychology in undergrad, and it didn't knock my socks off. So I was just like, oh, how do I, still be a mental health practitioner and not get a PhD in psychology? And so I went into social work. And, because one of the things I liked that social work offered was that you could get a degree in clinical social work and do therapy, but also the work was emphasizing that, at that time, it was really a big focus on working with like marginalized communities,
Okay.
and the idea of like social justice was like wrapped up in the therapeutic work. And so as a result, I was working in places like homeless shelters. You and I met working in a preventive services program. So working with, children who either have been removed from their families or were in danger of being removed or had been returned, and, trying to work to keep those families together. And then I did a lot of work for a very long time at an organization where we serviced people who were coming out of state hospital centers. And so people who had not only been hospitalized for psychiatric reasons, but had actually been like institutionalized, had actually involuntarily been sent to like state treatment. And often those people, on top of the mental illnesses that they suffered, or I also worked with people who came out of like developmental disability facilities.
Okay.
They were ill, often had substance abuse problems, had just like a copious amount of like comorbidities and, problems that affected their life every day. And, in many of those experiences, like I kind of like would have a light bulb moment where I'd be working with somebody and I'd be like, wow, this person not only, has a diagnosis of schizophrenia or depression or whatever, but they're severely traumatized,
Okay.
um,
Okay.
and so that's when I was just like, wait, this trauma thing is like, it's
Serious.
big.
Yeah, serious. Right. Right. You mentioned infertility and pregnancy loss, right? I have I don't know if it's an epidemic but I have quite a few women in my practice that come in
Mhm.
and talk about infertility issues, and
Yeah.
and how depressing it is and how much it affects them. Could you talk a
Yeah.
little bit about that?
Yeah. So it's kind of hard to from my perspective as a practitioner working in this field, I read a lot of literature all the time, medical stuff, like, psychiatric, psychological information. It's hard for me to determine exactly why it seems that infertility is so much more prevalent than it was 10 years ago or 20 years ago. Part of it could be because, I'm an older woman now. I, became a woman of childbearing age and wanted to have my own children. And so it was an issue that, I had to think about intimately. But I do think that there's something in the water. I do definitely think that, you hear people talking about infertility and pregnancy loss much more than you did years ago.
Right.
Part of it, I think, is because people feel a little bit more, they have permission to talk about their experiences. And these tend to be topics that people feel ashamed often to talk about, or like people will say literally like, don't talk about that, that's like private. And I think, the advent of the internet and us having information at our fingertips, literally, conversations are being had all over the world, and you can learn anything you want to about anybody, and anybody can share their experience. So it might just be that there's more awareness of it. I certainly do think that there is like some biological aspects, and I'm not a doctor or a scientist, so I'm not about to say why I think women are experiencing infertility in such much higher numbers, or much higher numbers than we, thought.
Okay.
But I definitely think it's like an issue that's plaguing people. And I think it does have at times a lot, in large part, to do with stress.
Okay.
I think our lives are so much more stressful today than they were 50 years ago. And not to say, that people, years ago didn't deal with difficulties, but I think it's not only are we experiencing stress, but like I mentioned a moment ago, we have so much more access to information. We have so much more of an ability to know like what's happening on the other side of the world that's terrible.
Okay.
Also what's happening like outside our windows that's terrible, that I think that people just carry large amounts of stress, and then they are vicariously traumatized, and I think that does something to your body. Certainly. I think it does something to you psychologically. And so, I just think that so many more women are finding themselves in positions where they want to have children and they cannot, or they are discovering that the road is not as straight as they thought it would be, that there's a lot of, zigzags.
Okay.
I also think that because of the advent of, medical technology and, kind of medical breakthroughs, there are now people who are saying, oh, I can't have children, I can't get pregnant, or I can't maintain a pregnancy. I'm going to go see a doctor and I'm going to try and work on this. So I think that, then also makes people feel more comfortable saying like, oh, I'm going to a reproductive endocrinologist, or I'm going to a fertility specialist. So to us, in a way, it may seem like, wow, this is such a big thing. And it probably is, but it also is probably because people are talking about it more than
Okay.
they ever have in the past.
Okay. Now, in terms of pregnancy loss, right? I read a statistic where it said something like 70% of the time when a married couple suffers miscarriages, that they get divorced. I might be saying
Yeah.
it wrong, but I'm saying it was something so alarming that I was like,
Yeah.
I couldn't believe how
The
or how
number.
much pregnancy loss is connected to divorce.
Well,
Yeah.
yeah. So, I mean, first of all, miscarriages are very common, right? I mean, and there's all types of ways that you can experience a pregnancy loss. I think miscarriage is the one that people think of most often and are probably most familiar with. And, there's statistics that say like 1 in 4 pregnancies ends in miscarriage. And do we know that to be true? We don't know, because I'm sure there are people who, suffer pregnancy loss and don't say anything, or who don't realize that they've were even pregnant. But, especially for the people who do know what is happening to them and what is happening to their body, it's extremely distressing. I think there are so many opportunities for women now to, be career people and, lead companies and like do all these things that sometimes was not necessarily thought of as opportunities that were available to women. At
Mhm.
the same time, I think there's still a large emphasis in our society on like women should procreate and they should be mothers and like no matter what else they do, this is like their primary role. So then, for someone who has kind of absorbed that ideal,
Okay.
or who feels that deeply or has had that pushed onto them deeply, to then not be able to have a child, or carry a pregnancy or to conceive is extremely devastating, but it also can lead to feelings of inadequacy or feelings like your body has failed you.
Mhm.
And so then imagine someone has experienced pregnancy loss, a woman,
Okay.
and she has a partner, whether that partner is a man or a woman, but she's going through all that stress and she's going through,
Mhm.
all of that difficulty. And then she's supposed to still show up in her marriage or in her relationship the way she did, prior to her loss. And then remember, like pregnancy loss is one of the traumas that is experienced in the context of your body. So it's not like, oh, I was in a car crash and my car was, totaled and now it's difficult for me to get to work, or which is stressful in and of itself, but the reminder of the trauma is you, because
Okay.
everywhere you go there you are and there's your body, right?
Mhm.
So imagine all of that, dealing with all of that, and then trying to be available to your partner, or be available if you have other children, or you have other family members that you have to be caretakers for. And then imagine not necessarily having the words to talk about what you're feeling.
Okay.
And
Okay.
healing is not linear, right? So like today I might be okay with the fact that I have experienced pregnancy trauma. Tomorrow I might be in a state. And so this up and down and kind of like inability sometimes to put what you're feeling into words, or to explain what that loss means for you and means for your hopes and your dreams,
Mhm.
can certainly stress a marriage, and if or a partnership. And if you were not a communicative couple before this, or even if you were and just like, something changed as a result of the loss, it sometimes can feel much easier to just be like, well, I'm not doing this anymore. I can't do this with you. Or maybe it's just not meant to be, because in some instances, the partner is the reminder of
Mhm.
like, this
Oh,
combination didn't work, you know?
okay. Okay.
So,
Okay. So
yeah.
now, so now, what do you prescribe in terms of like women who've gone through that? Like,
Mhm,
because I know obviously you work a lot with women who struggle with that or who have
mhm.
experienced that. So,
Yeah.
what are just maybe if you can give some like feedback, tips, insights, that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So, I definitely think that it's something that should be discussed. I think it's really hard to say that there are like rules that we want to apply to every situation in life. And like you always do this because, people do their own thing and they heal in their own ways. I definitely think with pregnancy loss and infertility and like pregnancy trauma, it is something that, those who are suffering from it or have suffered with it, I think will benefit from talking about for sure. It doesn't mean you have to tell every single person that what you've been through. It doesn't mean you have to always, talk about it at every, you know, social opportunity, but you do need to find a safe space, whether that's with your partner, whether
Okay.
that's with, a very good friend,
Hmm.
whether it's with your medical provider. Obviously, I think it's a good idea to talk about it in therapy.
Okay.
And because I think it's a very special kind of loss. And it's not, it's not like the struggle Olympics where I'm like, oh, people who are suffering from infertility and pregnancy loss are so much more traumatized than people who experience sexual trauma. I'm not suggesting that, but I am suggesting that it is a very unique pain that and an experience that often unless someone's gone through it themselves or unless they have been, intimately familiar with someone who's gone through it, it's misunderstood. And
Okay.
so I definitely think that when you can, if you want to find a safe space to talk about your feelings and talk about your loss, it's important to try to find someone who understands that. So I
Okay.
think it means that you have to say to your therapist, like, did you have a miscarriage? Not necessarily.
Right.
But I think it's beneficial when you can find someone who has,
Now, in terms of the partner, whether it's a husband or
Yeah.
life partner, what I guess what would you say to them?
So I would say, to not shut down your own feelings. I think, most often, and, everybody's experience is different, but, more often than not, if a woman has lost a pregnancy, her partner is male, right? So in most instances, we're talking about a man, being on the other end of that loss. And I think men are socialized to, not have feelings, not cry, not become upset. And I think that that is probably like the worst thing for a male partner to do.
Okay. All
Because
right. You hear that, fellas? Go ahead.
yeah, they want to be, they want to project this, manliness and strength. But I think often what happens is two things. It doesn't give them an opportunity to grieve.
Hmm.
It doesn't give them an opportunity to just like really feel the disappointment and the sadness, or you know, to explore mentally like what happened or why did that happen or what's the meaning of this. And then two, I think it often kind of sends the wrong message to the partner, which is that like everything's cool, it doesn't matter, like we just had this loss, but I'm good, and I'm just going to keep going on with my life. And so but in both instances it's not helpful because there's no like real processing, or people don't feel that they can be comfortable, you know um with their own grief or expressing their grief to their partner. I think then when you have cases like, lesbian couples or gay men
Hmm.
couples who, maybe are trying to grow their family, but they are experiencing, like if they have a surrogate, the surrogate may, lose the baby, or, you know, they may try to adopt and it may not be successful. I think that then there's all this other extraness on top of an
Right.
already difficult process that just makes it really hard for people. So I think for men in particular, it's not all women are like great at identifying their feelings, but I think women tend to kind of
Right.
give a little more sometimes
Right. Most of the
emotionally.
time. All right.
Yeah, I think for men, it's really important that they speak up and that they find a space to talk about it. And actually, in my own work now, I don't know many, women therapists and practitioners who do what I do, but I am discovering that there are some men who
Hmm.
actually are doing this work, and they're doing the work for, men who have experienced, infertility, loss in their partnership, or pregnancy loss with their partner.
Okay.
So, we're out there.
Okay.
You have to
Yeah,
try to find us.
I haven't heard too many men doing that, but
Yeah.
that's good to know. That's definitely good to know. Um, well, you mentioned earlier that in terms of you having trauma with infertility and pregnancy loss, could you share a
Yeah.
little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So, I um I I got married when I was 36. And so I was a little bit like on the older side in terms of like, people who are first considering like growing a family. I got married when I was 36, and my husband and I kind of had said we wanted to wait a little while after we got married
Okay.
to kind of, work on, make sure our relationship was stable and stuff like that. And
Right.
so we I don't think we started trying until I was like 37, maybe almost 38. I'm not sure. Um, but something that did impact my situation was that I had at one point very large fibroids that I
Okay.
had to have removed. And so like
Hmm.
I want to just like pull this golden thread through my whole experience, which is that I had been seeing a GYN like on a regular basis, the way like everybody's supposed to annually or, every twice a year or whatever, since I was an adult, never had any issues, was never told that I had fibroids. I decided that the doctor who was my GYN, he was a man, and I don't think that because he was a man, I don't think that was a problem, but I found myself in many situations where I was like asking him questions and like he was just like, I don't know. And I was like,
Okay.
okay. I mean, it's fine to not know something, but you're a practitioner. You know that when a client or a patient asks you a question, if you don't know, it's okay to say you don't know, but you can also then say, let me try to find out about that. Or,
Right.
maybe I have a colleague that I can consult, or let me do some research. There was never that degree of curiosity expressed. So I was like, okay, I'm going to find somebody else. So I have a friend whose sister is a doctor, and her sister was like, this is my GYN. She sent me to her GYN. She's like, she's highly, she comes highly recommended and everything. The first time I saw this doctor, before she even examined me, she said to me, has anyone ever said to you that you have fibroids? And I'm like, no, why? Why? And she's like, I'm 99% sure. She's like, looking at the curvature of your stomach, that you have
Wow.
fibroids, right? And I was like, whatever. She's like crazy now, because I've been going to the doctor, right?
Right. Right.
So
Wow.
she examines me and she's like, yep, you have fibroids. And she's like, your
Wow.
doctor never said anything to you? And I was like, no, So it turns out that they were not at the size where they really needed to be removed, because, depending on where you are kind of in your like fertility, like planning and everything,
Right.
sometimes we'll say, don't remove them unless you know that you're then going to try, if you want to get pregnant, to get pregnant like soon thereafter, because there's always a possibility of them removing the fibroids and then them growing back and then having to kind of like start all over again. So I was fine. I was being monitored on a regular basis. At first I was being monitored every 6 months, no growths, still below the size that they needed to be removed. And then I went through a very, very stressful period in my life, like career wise and stuff. And I really think that probably like the presence of like increased stress hormones and just kind of like not great self-care, probably was a contributing factor. And my fibroids kind of just like exploded and like,
Wow.
grew exponentially. So I got to the point where I had to have my fibroids removed. And so I had them removed. I went to see a reproductive endocrinologist. This is when my husband and I were like, I think still just engaged, but we were like, we're going to get married. We want to have children. And so I went to the reproductive endocrinologist and I was like, what should I do? And he's like, well, I think you should remove them. He's like, and he kind of gave me like a window period about, how long I should wait.
Okay.
I should say before I went to this reproductive endocrinologist, I went to another doctor and I was just like, kind of, what do you recommend? Do you recommend that I remove the fibroids? Do you recommend that I wait? And he was like, just have a baby. And I was like,
Okay. I'm sorry. Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
I was like, well, one, I'm not married. For me, it was important that I be married, when I wanted to, have a child. And I was just like, there's stuff going on in my life that's not really, like possible for, it's not like part of the plan right now. And he was like, just have a baby. And and he was a white doctor.
Mm.
And I remember I was in his office, like after the exam and everything, I came into like his like office part and he had a picture of like his family on like a bookshelf. And there was like a girl in the picture, in a few of the pictures. And obviously like it was like his daughter or something. She's like 20 something, whatever. And I remember when he said to me, just have a baby, I was like, would you tell her that?
Wow.
Because I was like, I felt like he was saying that to me because he was like, oh, here's this Black woman, they have babies all the time, whatever, just do it.
Wow. Wow.
So I was like, nope, that's not the doctor for me. I wound up finding a really good reproductive endocrinologist who was sensitive, who was helpful. His name is Dr. Bradley Trevax. And he was like, I'm going to remove them. He was like, but because they're at this point now, like causing problems for you. And he was like, but when you get ready to try and have a child, come back. And it doesn't necessarily mean you need IVF or whatever, but like, I'll just see what's going on.
Okay.
So we waited and we got married and we had a little bit of a waiting period. And then I was like, okay, we're ready to get pregnant. So we went to him and he kind of like took me through this like cycling. I didn't do any IVF or anything, but he like monitored my hormones and all of that. And we got pregnant on the first try.
Wow.
And I literally was like, like shocked because I was like, okay, you know, you hear all these stories.
Right.
And we were so overjoyed. And then, you know, because I was being seen by a doctor, like I went very early in the pregnancy. And so I found out that I was pregnant like before the point where they would even have seen anything on the sonogram or, you know, so I knew I was pregnant because of a blood test, but there was nothing really to be seen at that point. When I finally got to the point where they should have been able to see, you know, a yolk sac or you know, a fertilized egg or whatever you want to call it,
Right.
they couldn't see anything. And so the doctor was like, oh, you know, you have what's known as a pregnancy of unknown location, PUL, which essentially is an ectopic pregnancy,
Okay.
where, you know, you're pregnant, but somehow the fertilized egg didn't make it to the into the uterus. They don't know where it is, but it's not viable, right? And so basically the doctor was like, you know, you have to basically medically manage the pregnancy, which is basically you have to take medication to stop the growth, the cell growth, because wherever it is, it shouldn't be there. And depending on where it is, it can be fatal
Right.
because for some women, the pregnancy gets stuck in their tube
Right.
and then their tube bursts. So long story short, I had to medically manage the pregnancy. It wasn't viable. I had to take medication. I felt, you know, very upset about it. And I was being monitored because after you do that, you have to be monitored for a long time to make sure you don't have any more pregnancy hormone in your system. And I was like almost at the end of the process and I got sick. And I thought that, like, silly me, I was like, oh, I probably have like food poisoning or something. Because I think my mind was just like, it can't be, you know. Oh, so the doctor had given me this piece of paper. He was like, if you ever wind up in the ER during the, you know, this process, until we clear you, he's like, you need to give this paper to the ER. And it basically explains like, this person has had an ectopic pregnancy. This is the treatment. These are the things you need to check for. So I went to the hospital and I said, like, I had an ectopic pregnancy. I was treated with methotrexate. I haven't had surgery. I gave them the form and they were like, oh, you had a miscarriage? And I was like, no, I had an ectopic pregnancy. Back and forth, back and forth. Miscarriage. Nope, nope, nope. So long story short, they examined me and they're like, yeah, whatever you're feeling is probably the result of having taken methotrexate. At this time, it's like 4 weeks after I took methotrexate, right?
Okay.
And I'm like, well, what about this paper? They're like, no, we examined you, like you're all good. Like, you know, they're like, you can go home. So that was a Thursday night. I remember that. I went home
Uh-huh.
and I was supposed to go to the doctor to see the doctor who was monitoring me like on Tuesday. And
Right.
so like, when's the next time you see the doctor? I'm like, Tuesday. They're like, yeah, just keep that appointment and you know, you'll be good. I went home, I went to sleep. When I woke up, I could not get out of the bed.
Wow.
I was in so much pain. My husband had to like literally like pull me up. And
Okay.
I think I knew like somewhere in my mind, like my tube is burst, but I think I still was like, meh, it can't be. So
Wow.
I called my doctor and I was like, this is what's happening. And they're like, come in. I drove myself to the doctor's office because I just couldn't compute, like it didn't compute. So I went to the doctor. They examined me, they scanned me, and the doctor literally said, it wasn't my doctor, it was his partner. She was like, I'm sending you to the ER. And I'm like, why? And she's like, because your tube burst. And she did not have good bedside manner, but she was like, you know, and your guts are floating around in blood. And, you know, she's like, and I don't have anything to resuscitate you with. So you need to go to the hospital.
Wow.
So like,
Wow. That's horrible.
horrible. And
Right.
not only did they send me to the ER, they sent me back to the same ER I had visited the night before. And I was like, oh no, please don't send me there. Like these
Right.
people kill me. And they were like, that's the closest hospital. We cannot afford to send you to NYU, which is across the bridge, because God forbid you go into shock, you could die. So I wound up in the same hospital.
Okay.
Okay, but
Right.
Luckily, my medical team was a team of Black women. I had Dr. Carr, a Jamaican OBGYN. She had a resident with her who was a Trinidadian OBGYN. I had a Black anesthesiologist, and the head nurse was Black. These women saved my life.
Well, amen. All right.
So I wound up, I lost my tube, and but
Wow.
I lived. And so then, we went on to try like 2 more times. I had 2 actual miscarriages. I finally had my daughter, who was 5
Wow.
now. And then we tried to grow our family a little bit more, and I wound up having 2 more miscarriages. So I only have the 1 child. So unfortunately, in my life, I've experienced 5 pregnancy losses. And one of them was, was life-threatening. And I do believe I was mismanaged, first when I went to the original GYN, who didn't say anything about fibroids, the second GYN, who was like, just have a baby, and when my doctor was like, if you had gotten pregnant with those fibroids, he was like, there would have been no space for your baby. It was like, and you could have, like, your fibroids could have degraded and you could have died.
Wow.
And then I went to the ER and gave them all the information, and they still sent me home to die.
Wow. Wow.
So for me, that's my trauma.
Wow. Well, geez. But let me ask you, is this story more common than we know?
Unfortunately, it is. And unfortunately for Black women, pregnancy, I mean, I always say that, like, pregnancy, like, when you're pregnant, you really are like walking the line between life and death, because like you're creating a life, you're alive, you're creating this life within you, you're trying to keep this baby healthy and, bringing this baby to term. But there's so many things that could go wrong that, and if someone like misdiagnoses or doesn't pay attention to you, literally it could end in, a very adverse medical situation for you, or death. What we do know statistically is that Black women experience an exponentially higher rate of maternal death during pregnancy than their white and other non-Black counterparts. And that's because of medical, racialized medical mismanagement. That's because, we know that there are studies that say that many medical students believe that Black people don't experience pain the way their other race counterparts are. We know that Black women traditionally are dismissed. We know that traditionally Black women are looked down on, especially if they're not married or they're not in a committed partnership and they're pregnant. So there are all these isms that come into play when clinicians and many medical providers are making decisions about you that could determine whether you live or die. I don't know if you're familiar that, like, Serena Williams, when she had her baby, she just was feeling like something was off, and she kept complaining. And like, this is, the most famous tennis player in the world, someone obviously who has a lot of financial power and notoriety, and yet she wasn't listened to. And if she hadn't have been persistent, she could have died, because it turned out she had a blood clot, and she had to keep saying, like, listen to me, listen to me. There's also a movie that's going to be showing on Hulu. I think it might be tomorrow. It might be June 19th or June 27th. Anyway, July 19th or July 27th. It's coming out on Hulu. It's called Aftershock. And it's a movie that was created by a friend of mine, actually. Her name is Shawnee Benton Gibson, and she's a social worker too.
Okay.
And I've known her for years. And unfortunately, Shawnee lost her daughter. Her daughter experienced, I believe it was a blood clot after postpartum.
Okay.
And so she gave birth, and, she went home, and I think she had complained a couple of times to her providers about the fact that she felt like something was off, and she was like dismissed, and or they didn't really pay enough attention to it. And unfortunately, her daughter lost her life because, she wasn't heard. And so Shawnee, who's like this fabulous kind of women's advocate, and she's a social worker, she's a therapist, she does so many good things. She made a movie about it. And I believe it was at Cannes. I mean, it's won awards and everything. And so I'm really excited to see it.
Okay.
But Shawnee really like, she knows this stuff, you know, and she knows the plight of Black women when they are trying to give birth. And, you know, she made this movie in homage to her daughter. Unfortunately, that Shawnee's story and her daughter's story is all too common.
Wow.
It's too common.
Wow.
So, yeah.
I mean, listen, definitely thank you for being so transparent. I mean, no, I believe that there's so many people that could benefit from hearing your story.
Mm-hmm.
I guess, do you like, in terms of speaking to your clients, like, do you push for them to be more vocal with their doctors, or they are to recommend them to get doctors of their same race or anything of that?
Yeah. So I do, you know, I mean, and, you know, sometimes in therapy, you know, when we went to school, you know, there's this whole thing about disclosure and like, do you talk about your personal life and is it appropriate? Is it unethical? I mean, obviously this is like something that I'm open about. I try not to like make the sessions that I have with my clients about my experience, you know,
Right.
I share with them that I've been through something similar, but not talk in the session about me per se, but I definitely will encourage my clients if they are pregnant or even if they're trying to get pregnant and they're having difficulty and they feel unheard, to keep searching for the provider that is going to hear you, you know. Oftentimes for Black women that can be another Black provider, sometimes it's not. You know, I have a wonderful OBGYN. She's a Black woman, her name is Angela Carr, she's great, right? But I've also seen in the course of my life other, you know, Black GYNs here and there, and it doesn't mean that they were great to me, you know. So just being Black doesn't mean that, you know, you're going to be listening or whatever.
Right.
So I encourage people, if you feel comfortable with a Black provider, by all means, search that provider out, you know. But more importantly than their race or their ethnic heritage, it's, do they listen to you? Right. And so if you're raising an issue and I have a question about this, or I'm uncomfortable, or something doesn't sit right with me, or I don't feel good, and you feel dismissed by your provider, whether it's a man, whether it's a woman, whether they're Black, white, whatever, move on. Right. Move on, because, you know, that could be the difference between you saving your own life one day, you know. I think about the fact that if I had ignored my mind's desire to deny what I probably on some level knew was going on, but just couldn't like deal with it. If I had just said like, oh, they said go, wait till Tuesday, let me wait till Tuesday, I would be dead. Wow. Literally dead, because I was bleeding internally, you know. So I thank God that I had the persistence to just like seek out somebody else, you know. Some people don't, you know, and unfortunately with ectopic pregnancies, you know, many women are not properly diagnosed because it's something that statistically is rare, and it's something statistically that is not often diagnosed without the patient like pushing and saying like, I'm in so much pain, or something doesn't feel right, and then somebody really paying attention.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, listen, I've gotten a little mini education here.
Yeah.
Goodness. I mean, I definitely am excited to share this information with my clients. You know, I guess, do you have I think you're running a group now, right? Like a specialty group?
Yeah, so I have a weekly group that I run for women suffering from infertility and pregnancy loss, either or both. You know, so if someone falls into that category, certainly they can, you know, reach out to me and talk to me about the group. I do work with people on an individual basis around their trauma in relationship to this stuff. I also do like infertility and pregnancy loss coaching.
Okay.
Because I think that it's a very unique experience. I think that it's something that is hard. It's hard to find a provider who knows about this. And I think that, you know, certainly therapy is appropriate, obviously talking about trauma and talking about your experience and working through it. But I think sometimes what's missing from that whole like well-being kind of process is like, what do you do after, you know, you've experienced the infertility or the pregnancy loss? Or, you know, how do you make a plan to move forward? How do you decide, like, should we continue to try or should we pursue other options? Or if you've decided, like, I'm not going to do that anymore, we're not going to pursue childbirth anymore. How do you reconcile with what has happened, or, you know, the changes or the challenges that your body or, you know, medicine has imposed on your life? And so what I'm really interested in doing and I'm passionate about is helping women kind of get to the next level. I want you to have your baby. You know, I really want you to, like, if you want a baby, I want a baby for you. If you want 10 babies, I want 10 babies for you. But more so than just having your baby, I'm interested in you healing, and I'm interested in helping couples, you know, kind of stay together, you know, because my husband and I surely experienced a lot of challenges, and we're still here together because we worked hard and it was hard. So I'm like hoping to see people get to the next level, which includes their baby and their family, but also includes like them being whole and them feeling hope and excitement and joy, and possibility again.
So how do people contact you if they want to you know, get the help that you offer? How do people?
So I can be reached at 646-489-8874. I can also be reached at Ayanna, that's Ayana, at Ayanna Ali LCSW.org. So that's Ayana at sign Ayana Ali L as in Larry, C as in cat, S as in Sam, W as in Walter.org. I can also be found on Instagram at Ayanna Ali LCSW. I'm on Psychology Today. I'm on Alma. If you just type my name into Google, I should show up. So,
That might be the easiest way, I guess, right?
Yeah.
Wow. Well, listen, thank you so much for coming by. I
You're
really
welcome.
appreciate the insight that you gave us. Well, thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. I'm so glad to be here. And anytime I have a chance to talk about this stuff, I welcome it. So I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks again.
If I ever took a loss, I learned a lesson. I won't ever think I'm better than the next man. I've been down before to come up, I ain't stressing. Baby, I'm too busy.